Hello students. Electrolysis. Electrolysis, there are two words. Electro means flow of electron or electricity, and lysis means breaking or separating. Electrolysis. We already discussed the metal act as a good conductor and non-metal act as a bad conductor or non-conductor. Now, chemical compound which conduct electric current when it in a molten state means aqueous state, then it conduct current, then it is known as it act as a electrolyte. So students, any chemical compound solid, it converted into liquid state or aqueous state, then it conduct electricity or it conduct current, then it is known as a electrolyte. Suppose NaCl example, it is in a solid state. When it converts into liquid state or aqueous state or it in a molten state, then it is act as a strong electrolyte. NaCl. Now students, non-electrolyte. Non-electrolyte means any chemical compound which do not electric current is passes, which do not conduct current, in a solid state or in a liquid state, then it is known as a non-electrolyte. Example, sugar solution, when present in a solid state or in a liquid state, aqueous medium, they do not conduct electric current, then it is act as a non-electrolyte. The solution of sugar solution, it is an example of non-electrolyte. Example of electrolyte: acid containing sulfuric acid, nitric acid, phosphoric acid, HCl. It is an example of acid. This example are act as a electrolytes. Now bases: sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, ammonium hydroxide, calcium hydroxide. It is another electrolytes of bases. And some example of salt: NaCl, copper sulfate, lead bromide. It is a salt. It is a example of electrolytes. Now electrolytes, which on classify into two types: strong electrolyte and weak electrolyte. Strong electrolyte and weak electrolyte. Now strong electrolyte, acid having HCl, sulfuric acid, nitric acid. It is an example of strong acid. Concentrated sulfuric acid is an example of strong acid. It is weak electrolyte, but when it in the form of dilute condition, diluted, then it acts as a strong electrolyte because it is a completely dissociate into ions, and large amount of electricity to flow up through them. It allow large amount of electricity flow through them. Then it is a good conductor of electricity when it in the form of diluted, because it produce more concentration of H plus ion when it dissociation into ions. Suppose HCl it produces H plus ion and Cl minus ion. It is an example of electrolytes. H2SO4, it produces H plus ion 2 times H plus ion and SO4 minus 2 ions. HN3, it dissociates into H plus ion and NO3 minus ion when in a diluted. Then it is a good conductor of electricity because they are completely ionized or dissociate into ions. Now example, students, it gives HCl give H plus ion, Cl minus ion. H2SO4 give 2H plus ion and SO4 minus 2 ion. And nitric acid HN3 gives H plus ion and NO3 minus ion. It is an example of strong electrolyte. All are acid. Now base having sodium hydroxide. It is a strong base. It completely dissociates into Na plus ion and OH minus ion in the aqueous solution. Or a KOH means it produces K plus ion and OH minus ion. Therefore, it is an example of strong electrolyte. It is an example of strong electrolyte and it is a good conductor of electricity. And another example of salt having NaCl. Now example of NaCl, salt. It dissociated in water which are Na plus ion. It produces Na plus ion and Cl minus ion. It is a completely dissociate into ions. It produces Na plus ion and Cl minus ion in aqueous state, in a molten state. When in a solid state, it do not conduct electricity. When it converts into molten state or liquid state, it is a great conductor of electricity. It is a great conductor of electricity because it produces Na plus ion and Cl minus ion. Same example, copper sulfate. Copper, it produces copper plus 2 ion and SO4 minus 2 ion in aqueous solution, in aqueous state or molten state. Same example, lead bromide, it produces Pb plus 2 and 2 times Br minus ion. Then it is also example of good strong electrolyte. Now students, weak electrolyte. Weak electrolyte means it is a partially or incompletely dissociated into ions in the aqueous solution. Example, weak acid, weak base and some salt, which are example of weak electrolyte. It is an example of weak electrolyte means it is a partially or incompletely dissociated. Therefore, it is a poor conductor of electricity. It is a poor conductor of electricity and it allows small amount of electricity to flow of them. It allows small amount of electricity flow of them. Now example, in acid containing acetic acid. It is an example of weak electrolyte. It produces acetate ion and H plus ion in the aqueous solution, but it is a partially or incompletely dissociated. Therefore, this weak acid, acetic acid, example of weak electrolyte. Another example, oxalic acid. Oxalic acid, it is also example of weak electrolyte. Next, carbonic acid. Carbonic acid means H2CO3. It is also partially dissociated into H plus ion and carbonate ion CO3 minus 2. Then it is an example of weak electrolyte. Now bases having bases like calcium hydroxide. Now this weak electrolyte, this solution containing presence of ions as well as molecule, both present, ions and molecules. But in case of strong electrolytes, it only produce ions. In case of strong electrolyte, it produce only ions. But in suppose example, Weak electrolyte example, it is a base calcium hydroxide. It is a partially dissociated, then it form maybe ions or molecule. It is an example of weak electrolyte. Now another example, ammonium hydroxide. It is an example of weak electrolyte. Ammonium hydroxide, it is an example of weak electrolyte. It produces NH4 plus ion and OH minus ion in the aqueous solution. It is a poor conductor of electricity. It is a poor conductor of electricity because it is a partially or incompletely dissociated into ions in the aqueous solution. Another example, sodium carbonate base completed, now salt, sodium carbonate, NO2CO3. It is an example of base. It is a this base, it is a weak electrolyte. Another example, sodium bicarbonate, NaSCO3. It is also another example of weak electrolyte. It is a partially dissociated into ions. Now difference between strong electrolyte and weak electrolyte. Strong electrolyte means it is a completely dissociated into ions. Strong electrolyte completely dissociated into ions in the aqueous solution, and weak electrolyte, it is a partially or incompletely dissociated into ions. And strong electrolyte having completely dissociated means it produces large amount of energy to flow up through them, and weak electrolyte having partially dissociated, therefore poor means small amount of electricity is passing through of them. Now strong electrolyte act as a good conductor and weak electrolyte act as a poor conductor. We already discussed the example. Strong acid, it is an example of strong electrolyte, and weak acid, it is an example of weak electrolyte. Strong base, it is example of good electrolyte or strong electrolyte, and weak base, it is example of weak electrolyte. And there are some salt like NaCl, copper sulfate, lead bromide, copper chloride in a molten state or aqueous state, then it is act as a strong electrolyte. And some salt like sodium carbonate, bicarbonate, it is an example of weak electrolyte.